well, let
said
me
you were
answer.
going to answer my question.
I am answering your question.
If people are biologically
so if we take
born
away, I'm just going to
physically
keep talking as though you're polite here. So if we take intersex and we take, for example,
it's not polite to question
Kleinfelder's,
people's existence.
this is designed to be a discussion that hopefully opens a civil dialogue. I believe in searching for the truth. My presupposition is that there are two genders, and if you would like to change my mind on that, you're more than welcome.
Sure. Well, so I heard my boss talking a lot about a spectrum, not just in terms of like gender identity, but also in terms of really any biological trait, right? That humans exist on a spectrum, whether it's a racial spectrum, like there are people that are half something or whatever, biologically we're all on a spectrum. Some men can grow facial hair and some can't. Like some of it's defined by your chromosomes, some of it's defined by hormone levels, some of it's defined, I think you would not refute that we all exist biologically on a spectrum in terms of our phenotypes, right? And how we...
There are certainly differentiations between people. For example, you can have a multitude of men. Some are tall, some are short, some are fat, some are thin, some have red hair, brown hair, yeah.
So
but they're all men, yeah.
It's nice when we can agree on something.
Yeah.
Well, so in terms of that spectrum, and where I hope that like my existence can shed some light for you, I was actually born intersex, which means that like you would never know this, and no one who's ever been with me sexually would ever know this either. But I was actually born with XY chromosomes, and so instead of having a uterus and ovaries, I had internal testes that were then removed from me by doctors who come from kind of your perspective and some similar perspectives that we need to normalize people to fit these like society-driven standards of what a human is or should look like. But so for me, my question for you is, if I irrefutably was born intersex, like I can...
That's okay. You don't. I'll just
I
go.
don't need to get my like birth certificate.
No.
Yeah. Thank you. That was another thing. This whole birther thing, right? It's like proving
birther.
Basic truth. Yeah, the whole birther movement, right? Like needing to show our birth certificates to like prove our legitimacy as humans. I'm thinking back to Trump and Obama and everything. Anyway, that's not where I was.
Yeah, unrelated.
Unrelated.
That was silly.
So if it is irrefutably true that I was born intersex and that actually almost 2% of the world's population, so 150 million individuals worldwide were born intersex and then normalized through surgeries or otherwise, if we are born somewhere in between in terms of our like biological traits, then how can it not also be true that we might identify somewhere in between in terms of our gender and how that presents itself? Like certain people are born, for example, with breasts and a penis, or they might have ambiguous genitalia, or like me, like I was born with like, I hate that I have to sit here at a table with you talking about my genitalia. I don't believe any human should ever have to do that.
You don't have to.
Well,
you
the reason that
down.
And the reason I am is because there are people like you and that are, I was about to say with respect, but that don't respect basic biology, people's identities, and like that was kind of my biggest argument against the bathroom bill when I was arguing with Lois Kolkhorst, is like, if you want to pass a discriminatory piece of legislation, at least open a bio textbook first. Like it's not hard. Like these are just like basic science.
Okay. So a couple of things there. First off, I hope you don't feel as though I forced you to sit down here in any way.
No, you didn't force me, but the conversation and the existence of it, that's what forces me, because there are people who like are so fed up with having to legitimize their existence on a daily basis when you don't have to do that, right? Like you were born in a way where like no one is challenging that, and that's something that I heard my boss talking about too.
It's actually not true. But we don't need to get into my personal history.
Okay.
So you mentioned a couple of things there. I want to sort of.
Is there any water for?
There isn't. We used to until we realized that it was a legal liability. If maybe Danielle can get you a bottle of water, because the last thing you want is someone saying that I poisoned you. I would never do that.
Yeah.
I'm sure you can understand. So you mentioned basic biology textbook, and then you immediately followed up with how someone identifies.
Yeah.
I think they're two separate issues. Now, I understand that you're intersex. We've talked about this with several.
Right. So then what do you think in relation to that?
Yeah. So we've talked about intersex. So another thing I would strongly disagree with, statistically, you said 2% of the population are intersex.
I said almost 2. I believe it's 1.7.
I believe it's significantly lower than that, particularly in the Western civilization, much lower.
There's actually a dearth of data, though, as well, because what happens is doctors will play God and make a decision about what biological sex a child should have, and so they perform a surgery, and sometimes the parents aren't even made aware, or like with foster children, right? Like the state makes these decisions. So
you would believe it's higher than 2%?
I don't have a printout of like a bio textbook with me, but I don't want to argue with you.
You referenced a biological textbook.
Like irrefutable truths, right? We can talk about your opinion, right? But like I don't want to argue with you about science.
Sure.
Really.
Well, you haven't stated any irrefutable truths, so let's get to what the truth is.
Okay.
So you believe it's higher than 2%?
I
intersex?
said 1.7, and that's
But you
all
said
in
because
record.
doctors play God, the number's likely higher.
Oh yeah, right, exactly. Yeah,
Okay.
and because this is also like when data started being collected, right? Like
Sure.
is after a lot of these decisions have been made. There are people that aren't told by their parents or by doctors and don't even know until maybe they don't get their period or something like that.
Sure.
That like helps them realize
Yeah.
that they've been born different.
Right. So I want to do you believe it's higher than 2%, or you believe the statistic you've used is accurate? Because you just said biological truth. I want to make sure.
The statistic that I cited is as accurate as the information that we have available right now.
Okay.
But that information, as I just mentioned, is not necessarily fully comprehensive.
Sure. So you believe it
because
could be
of
higher. I want to make it
decisions
sure.
that are made by doctors.
Okay. I would say the statistic is significantly
I'm
lower
speaking for
from the
you.
literature that I've read. But again, let's remove intersex from the table because when we're talking about transgender, we're not generally talking about
Okay.
intersex. So intersex
But
Klinefelders,
but that
there are
was my
genetic
question.
anomalies.
But that was my question.
Yeah,
because
well, let me answer-
if
can I
someone's
answer your
in
question?
between, then why would their gender? So biologically, they're born in between.
Am I going to be allowed to answer at any point
Well,
here?
but let me just clarify my question because you
Okay.
said I'm talking about intersex and you're talking about transgender. But for me, this is related because if people are born in between, like in terms of physical manifestation, right?
Sure.
So then why should they have to choose I'm a male or a female if they were not born a male or a female? Like, yeah, that's my question.
Okay,
for you.
so I'm going to go back to answering your question.
Yeah.
All of this was very imperative in answering your question because you said biological realities, people need to read a textbook, and then you mentioned how somebody expresses themselves, how they identify. There are two different issues. I'd like to address them separately if we can.
But they're
because
not
I
separate.
agree.
That is
because
my
I,
question. You
well,
said
let me
you were
answer.
going to answer
I
my question.
I am answering your question.
If people are biologically
so if we take
born
away, I'm just going to
physically
keep
in
talking
between-
as though you're polite here. So if we take intersex and we take, for
It's
example,
not polite to question
Klinefelders.
people's existence.
We take, for example, intersex, we take Klinefelders, we take genetic anomalies that are very outside of the norm.
Referencing Klinefelter.
So, for
like
example,
more conditions.
there are some people, we've talked about this earlier, there are some people who are born without feet. There are some people who are born with webbed hands. There are some people who are born with 12 fingers and toes. But if what we teach in biology class is that human beings have 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 feet, 10 fingers and toes. We don't teach biology. We don't identify biology
human
based on
beings.
certain
Based on a spectrum
based
of
on
existence.
outsiders. Yeah, we don't. That's not how we teach biology.
So
that's not how
because I'm an outsider, then
That's not how doctors treat biology. So let me go to your. So I want to separate what we were talking about there: intersex and a very small percentage versus transgenderism. People who
Okay.
choose to identify who aren't born that way. But because you keep pressuring me on that, let's go to intersex. Let me ask you this: were you among the statistical reality where you had some very distinct primary sex characteristics as intersex? Because the vast majority of people born intersex are not LGBTQAIP activists. They're people who are born with very clearly identifying traits. It's not just right in between. The vast majority have micro penis and large clitoris, internal testes,
the
and it's
vast
pretty easy to
majority.
identify. So was that the case with you?
yes, I was identified at birth as being intersex.
Okay, but was
But
it?
not everyone is, because as I mentioned,
No, was it the case
sometimes-
where you were identified as a female pretty quickly? You had primary sex-defining traits in that of a female?
Well, I was assigned a female because of the choice of the doctor that worked on me, right? But like I was born in between. So for me, like a doctor made a choice that even though I was born in between, even though they knew because of a what's that called? Amniocentesis. So they knew before I was born that I had XY chromosomes, but because I was born with a vagina, they knew that I was intersex, but because there's a doctor again who plays God and makes a decision because it's all what's going to go on the birth certificate, I was
Right.
assigned female at birth.
Okay, so you didn't transition later on in life?
No.
No, okay. So my question again for you is just because the statistics would reflect that the overwhelming majority of people born intersex are not just born directly in between the two. There's a very clear delineation with identifying sexual characteristics with male and female.
That's so not true. There's
It is
chimerism.
true.
There's no.
It is true. But so moving on from the intersex, if we remove that, I think that you are. I think that what you're saying is correct. I would certainly
Pundit
separate
is
you.
telling someone who is born a certain way that you know more about the science of my existence than I do.
I'm not.
That's
The
point
literature
where, like,
is there, and
if we
I-
want to talk about our sides agreeing or being able to have productive conversations, I think that maybe that's a first step in y'all's camp, is like not assuming that you know better than everyone else who've
I
lived a
don't.
certain experience.
I don't. Just
You
like I
know?
don't interrupt.
Well, I'm sorry. You're interrupting my day by questioning my existence and my boss's existence. So I'm not going to apologize for interrupting.
I didn't question your existence. I haven't questioned your existence, and I haven't interrupted you, and I haven't said that I know more than you. Only you have done that in this conversation. So right now we're at a crossroads. We want to continue with this conversation and it to be civil and
I'm
to
just glad
disagree.
this is being televised or whatever, recorded.
As am
I
I.
look forward to watching it after.
So if we remove intersex, and very small percentage of outliers. Let's say it's the 1.7. I don't agree, but we'll go with that. Now we're addressing the transgender issue, that gender is a spectrum. So,
yes.
Why? How many genders are there? Why do we go with that? Because that's very separate from genetic anomalies of intersex.
Right. Gender is a societal construct. So, as my boss mentioned, there is a spectrum. So some people identify purely female or purely male. Some people identify in between. You already talked about the different pronouns that are available. And it's based on your something intrinsic that you were born with in your head. So we've proven, for example, that in terms of sexual orientation, that being gay is not a disorder. It's just like a biological reality. It's a human condition, right? And being transgender is the same thing. It's like you're born. There's actually studies that have come out now that transgender brains more closely align with the gender of the brain that they identify with than the brain of how they were born.
Can I address that?
Sure.
I have a question there. So you said, I want to make sure I'm not misrepresenting your view. You said gender is a societal construct. Those were your words.
It is, yeah.
Okay.
It is.
So if gender is a societal construct, how can there be a male brain and a female brain, as you just described?
Because there are brains that fit like more, if we're thinking about a spectrum, right? Like there's brains that fall here on the spectrum, brains that fall here on the spectrum. Like each brain biologically is different. Like we know this because of genetic variance. And so some people identify more with traits that we categorize as female. And so those brains look more similar to those who...
I'm sorry, but you're taking you said it's a societal construct, and now you're making a biological argument. Is there biologically a male brain and a female brain that are different?
There is biologically a brain that is closer to a binary example of how people who identify as male and present that way. Their brain looks more similar. And so even if they have been born with a body that, based on what we talk about in society, or phenotypically, like having certain like genitalia or gonads that we would say are female, their brain still looks more biologically similar, like when doing a brain scan, to someone who identifies as male. Like there are certain types of brain that exist on that spectrum.
Can you see how for me that's not a super clear answer? And I want to make sure that I don't get your presupposition incorrect. There are generally male brains.
I do a lot of
generally
interviews,
female.
So I know that like getting people to repeat the same answer.
No, it's not. None of this will be
looking for like an outlier that you can then cut and splice into something. But
none of this will be edited.
I'm happy to answer another question if you like.
None of this will be edited.
Okay.
None of it. All of this from beginning to end. If this goes up, if this interview we don't put up an interview that is edited. So I want to make sure that I understand your point of view here. They're generally considered a male brain biologically, and there is generally what is considered a female brain biologically.
Right, by how we as a society define male and female, but they're just like two ends of a spectrum.
The biological makeup of a brain is not societal. The biological makeup of a brain is biological.
But what I'm saying is so what I'm saying, the brain that you call the male brain or the female brain, with what you're saying.
You did, not me.
I'm saying is closer to that brain that you were referring to as a male brain.
You referred to it that way. So I want to make sure I'm correct that you believe there is a male brain generally and a female brain generally. I'm not going to say yes to you when I'm explaining my answer, when I'm giving you my answer.
Okay. My answer is what you are referring to as a male brain is more...
But I didn't. You did. That's why it's important. You brought this up, male brain and female brain. I'm trying to understand what you brought up. I didn't bring up male brain, female brain.
That brain is what society is referring to as a male brain. Whether that person was born, regardless of their genitalia and their physical presentation to the world, their brains are more similar in certain ways. And that is because there's a spectrum of types of brains. And so there's a brain that's like that, and then there's a brain that's slightly to the right on the spectrum, and then one that's slightly to the right of that. And there's this whole spectrum of types of brains, just as there is a spectrum of types of skin color or facial hair, all these different things that we've talked about, right? And so what we have found is there is actually a correlation between this identity and a brain that looks a certain way. So people aren't making something up. It's like something that intrinsically that they are born feeling and identifying in this way, right?
Feeling and identifying in a way, okay? Yeah. And this is important because the biology and the identification are two very different things. So I'm going to continue along the premise which you originally expressed. I certainly agree with the biology. There is a biologically defined male brain and female brain. They're different. They operate differently. There are different developments and different portions of the brain. They fire differently. They have different levels of neurotransmitters, and they respond to stimuli differently. There's a male brain and a female brain, absolutely.
And
there are some anomalies. There are some very acute number of outliers in between, but not much.
Huge.
There is a
The
male
entire
brain
world
and a
exists on
female brain.
spectrum.
Okay, well, the entire world exists on a spectrum. And then there are limitless genders and limitless brains. How do you determine what's right with the literature? How do you run a scientific study if you're saying there's a limitless number of brain types and a limitless number of identification types? How do you line that up as a study?
If myself does not threaten your daily existence, then why do you care?
It does. It does. It doesn't threaten my existence. I believe the restructuring of Western civilization based on, I don't believe gender is fundamentally interchangeable. I don't believe men and women are interchangeable.
So only Western civilization is right, is what you're saying? Because
that's a different conversation, but yes.
Really?
Yes.
So the whole white supremacist and Western perception of society is what is right?
I don't believe white supremacy is right at all.
Well, Western civilization is arguably founded by the colonization by white people of people of color that existed already.
No, Western civilization is not founded on white supremacy at all. So I believe Western civilization, the civilization that allows people to live freely, the civilization that freed slaves, the civilization that brought you that iPhone technology, paved roads, plumbing. The Romans did that earlier on, but it was very primitive. Yeah, I believe Western civilization is right. And a fundamental role in Western civilization is that of male and female. And I believe that that is very important as it relates to what we teach children, very important as to how we rear children, very important as to how we jail people if we're going to define pronouns, if we're going to define gender identification. I think it's important if we're going to change the entire fabric, the makeup, to identify what it is. So with that, how many genders are there?
You'll have to excuse me that I'm having trouble engaging with someone who feels that Western civilization is the right way, which is founded in these certain principles that I just mentioned.
It's not,
and the only way. And that America First mentality is actually what's causing the degradation and like our falling of our status in the world is American exceptionalism.
Really?
Or your exceptionalism of your viewpoint. If you really want to say change my mind, your mind is not open to other ways of thinking.
Well, here's one thing. If you're looking to change somebody's mind, coming in very aggressive and interrupting.
I'm angry. I'm not.
But that's not a good way to change somebody's mind.
Because you ask me a question and then I try to answer it and then you stop me halfway through and ask me a different question or tell me that I'm not responding to your question. So forgive me if I'm frustrated.
Yeah, well, I'm just trying to get clear answers to understand your presupposition. And then you were the one who brought up, for example, male brain, female brain, and said no, brains exist in a spectrum. Let me bring this up. This is a very new thing, that modern gender theory.
It's not a new
thing. The gender non-binary.
Where
does it stem from?
It doesn't. That's not the question. Again, you're asking multiple.
No, I'm asking you because you said it's not a new thing. I'm saying it is a new thing.
It's not a new thing. If you
okay, so where does it come
Greek
from?
or Roman mythology, there's all different types of humans. If you look at Hinduism or certain religions outside of your white, I imagine you're Christian, correct?
Yeah.
Right. Outside of that societal and worldview, there are a lot of different texts that are very, very old that talk about all different types of people.
Yeah.
That talk about trans people, intersex people that used to be referred to as hermaphrodites, which is a phrase that we don't prefer anymore. We find it to be very triggering and offensive because of the way that it's been used historically.
Okay, but it
kind
was
of like the
medically
N-word, right?
used,
Kind of
right?
like the N-word, right? Like there's a certain
well, not kind of like
context.
the N-word. Wasn't hermaphrodite a medical term?
No, now the medical term is intersex because the medical community understands that certain phrases then are used to marginalize other human beings until people stop using them. Was it a medical term? And so people stop using them.
Was it a medical term?
So medically, there also used to be something called phrenology, which was measuring like the heads of black people and saying that they were like scientifically less than others.
The only
science evolves all the time. You're asking if it was a medical term.
Yeah.
There also were medical terms like phrenology that are now shown to be very racist and bigoted and outdated and marginalizing.
The reason I bring it up,
and things that kind and open-minded humans do not use.
Sure. Well,
that is my response to your question.
Well, the reason I bring it up is because you brought up hermaphrodite and compared it to the N-word. Was the N-word ever a medical term?
I don't.
And the reason this matters, again, is yesterday's medical term is today's hate speech. Society can't keep up. And that's why definitions matter. That's why gender matters. That's why biological studies matter.
Like it's so hard for those people and not the people who are being marginalized.
Yes. I believe it's important. I believe it's important for both people to be in a society that functions.
I appreciate having the conversation. I really do.
Thank you very much.
I appreciate it. I'm sorry I don't have a box of tissues.
So let me give you real quick. Simone de Beauvoir in 1949. That's where modern gender theory started. Then it goes to Judith Butler in the 80s and 90s.
Watch Louder with Crowder live, Monday through Thursday, 10 a.m. Eastern.